Hello, welcome to lecture number 1, first lecture of Biology 222. In Biology 222, we're going to talk about organismal biology. So our first topic is going to be how are things related to each other? How do we classify them? Then we're going to start with protists. Then we're going to work our way up until we talk about mammals. Here I have some of my favorite organisms. I have Parker. Parker is on the left. He is the one in the tub with the beautiful yellow eyes. And then I have Max. He's the one on the right. He's in his bag. He loves grocery day because he gets to play in bags. And then in the center, I have a mushroom. I studied mushrooms for my graduate degree. My undergraduate was in botany, and then my master's is in mycology. And I love mushrooms. I am really excited to talk about fungus with you later in the term. This is one of my favorite mushrooms. It's called Mycena hematopus. Heme might sound familiar because that's the word for blood, right? And this mushroom bleeds. So if I were to cut it, if I were to scrape it with my pocket knife, it would bleed red blood. We call it latex, just like another organism would. So it's really pretty. We think that the reason that this mushroom bleeds is to prevent bugs from eating it because you don't want a mouthful of like bitter latex if you were a bug. And it has this beautiful little bump on top that's called an umbo, and it has this frilly little skirt on the cap. It's just a beautiful mushroom. This particular specimen is from Powell Butte in Portland, so right on the border of Portland and Gresham, one of my favorite places to go hiking. So organismal biology, welcome. I'm really excited to talk about it all with you. And the first thing that we're going to do is talk about how organisms are related. So taxonomy and the history of life, that is our first topic. Taxonomy is the system of naming things. So if you're a taxonomist, you're trying to identify things by name, which is actually not all that easy. So we have a technique for this called binomial nomenclature. What's the prefix bi? It's 2. So every organism gets 2 names. Nomial is going to be like naming. So humans are Homo sapiens, cats or Felis catus, dogs are canines. Like all of those names that we have are 2 parts. The first one, Homo, is our genus, and the next one is sapien, that's our species. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go too. So taxonomy is the process of naming things using binomial nomenclature. And then systematics, that's organizing things. Who is more related to who? What are the differences? Why is a dog different than a wolf? Like, how do we organize these critters? And to do that, we're going to use different taxonomic levels. They go from big, which is domain, to small, which is species. I'll show you each of those categories in just a second. Then once we figure out who is who and how to organize them into groups, we talk about their evolutionary history. That's called phylogenetics. So phylogenetics is going to be taking the information of identifying and organizing and putting it together to figure out who is more distantly or closely related to what organisms. And these are really cool because then we get to draw phylogenetic trees, and I'm going to teach you how to do that today. One of my favorite things to do. All right, here is our categories of life. Starting at the bottom, we have domain. So domain is going to be the biggest group. In your domain, our first domain is eukarya. Eukarya includes anything that has membrane-bound organelles. That includes a nucleus, a mitochondria, a chloroplast, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. Those are all membrane-bound organelles. So in your domain, you have way more things than in the next group. It is the largest bucket. So domain eukarya includes everything that has membrane-bound organelles. So in here, I have plant, insect, cats, dogs. All of these are mammals at the end, but these are dissimilar organisms. So this is the biggest collection of things together. So they are the least related. It's the largest grouping. And then as we go up, we're going to get narrower and narrower. So you'll note that our pyramid is getting smaller and smaller. So we're going to get more and more closely related with each of these groups. So here we have domain. That's our biggest grouping. Then we have kingdom. In the kingdom Animalia, it's everything that's an animal. So we've taken out plants. Then we have phylum. Chordata is anything with a nerve cord running down their back. So we've taken out bugs. So we're narrowing it down. We're getting more and more specific with each grouping. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, Mammalia. So now we've gotten rid of fish because they are not mammals. Mammals are anything with fur and they produce milk to feed their young. So these are all mammals. Order, Carnivora. So those are going to be organisms that eat meat that are mammals. So now we've gotten rid of rabbits because rabbits are herbivores. Then we have family, Canidae. Canidae is going to be the group that's all dog-like things. So fox, jackal, wolf. So we've gotten rid of cat. We're getting narrower and narrower. It's kind of like when you play Guess Who and you start eliminating people until you get to the person you want. Genus is Canis. Those are the canines, the canidids. We have jackal, wolf, and dog. Foxes are not canines. Species, Canis lupus. That's where we usually stop. But in Canis lupus, we have two things. We have a dog and a wolf. They're the same species, but we can tell those are not the same, right? So think about a sweet little chihuahua and a wolf. Those are not the same. How are they different? They are different subspecies. So to get down to the domestic dog, we need a subspecies level. And that's not true for everything. We don't use a subspecies for humans or for cats, but for dogs, we do. And so Canis lupus familiaris, that's going to tell us that this is the domesticated dog, where Canis lupus includes dogs that are not domesticated, which we call the wolf. So if I wanted one species here, I'm all the way down to subspecies. Things to note while I erase all my marks. Domain is the biggest, and species or subspecies is the smallest. So at the bottom, we have the largest grouping, and up at the top, we have the smallest grouping. As you go through from domain to species or subspecies, you're getting more specific. Let's see another example of this. Here, I'm starting with domain at the bottom, and then I'm going to get to either a cat or a dog. My domain is Eukarya. My kingdom is Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora. So those are all the same so far. And then we branch at family. So cats and dogs have different families. We have the Canidae or we have the Phylogeny. In the family Canidae, the genus for dog is Canis. The species is Canis lupus, but remember that includes wolves. And so now if we wanted to talk about our different types of domestic dogs, we would identify the subspecies Canis lupus familiaris, and that gives us our wonderful array of different types of domesticated dogs. For cats, the family is Felidae, the genus is Felis, and then the species is Felis catus. So we don't have a subspecies of cats. That's the only cat in the species, so we don't need to go further than that to identify the domestic house cat. Here we have different species of domestic house cats, and then we have the two cutest domestic house cats ever, Max on top and Parker below. Those are my two cats. The question about this is how, right? So if we're going to classify dogs differently from wolves, right? So we have Canis lupus, which included dogs and wolves. How do we know that there should be a subspecies? And to identify that, we have to talk about species concepts. So biologists don't agree about what makes a species, and there's three main ideas. In a morphological species concept, we identify species based on their overall body shape. So we say morphology is body shape. If I were looking at a flower, I would do things like I would count the number of petals. If I were looking at a fungus, I would identify what the spore size and shape was. If I'm looking at dogs, I could measure the height, from the foot to the rump of each of these different organisms. And they're quite different. So if I was using the morphological biologic species concept, I would say that a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are probably different species. And you might be like, well, why would you do this? What if they were fossils, right? If I were identifying things that have been dead for millions of years, all I have is an imprint of their body or their bones, and that's what I'm going to base my decisions on. So morphological works really well when you have things that you can't watch interact in real life. The next option that biologists use is the biological species concept. In the biological species concept, instead of looking at their bodies, we see whether or not these two things could interbreed. So we used to think that Chihuahuas and Great Danes would not be able to interbreed just because mechanically it doesn't seem like things would fit together, but that's not true. There are absolutely Great Dane Chihuahua hybrids, and that is a male Chihuahua and a female Great Dane, and they produce puppies, and they're totally viable and they live their lives. So if two species can interbreed, we say biologically they're the same species. And that's why dogs and wolves are in the same species. They can interbreed, they produce dog-wolf hybrids, so biologically, they're the same. And so then we had to split species into subspecies and add familiaris so that we knew that dogs and wolves were different, but the same. So biological species concept works really well for things like livestock and animals that we keep and can organize and like have some control over them. But it doesn't work well for things that we don't get to see breed. So mushrooms, we don't see them have sex often. We don't know when they breed or how it works. And so the biological species concept isn't really applicable for mushrooms because their sex lives are super secret. And also think about things like thousands of year old trees. Those things don't breed very often. Like as one biologist, I might have to wait 100 or 300 years for a seed to be produced. And that's just not practical. And so for things that don't breed often, or we don't understand how they breed, or they take way too long to breed, the biological species concept isn't useful. It also doesn't work for things that are extinct, like dinosaurs. We still don't know how dinosaurs had sex. And so we don't get to use the biological species concept for extinct organisms. For those organisms, the morphological species concept works better. And then the last one, the one that everyone likes most currently, is genetic. If your organisms are genetically similar enough, they're the same species. But enough, what's enough? How much is enough? And is it different for different organisms? What genes are we looking at? What if they are genetically similar, but they never interbreed and they have completely different bodies? So these three ideas of what makes a species are different for different types of organisms, and they're different for different types of biologists. As a mycologist, I use the morphological species concepts. If you were going into veterinary medicine, you're probably going to use the biological species concept. And if you're going into like studying viruses or studying parasites or studying protists, tiny little things, you're probably going to use the genetic species concept. So each of these is acceptable, and they're all used differently. And so it's a big fun game of what works best right now. We also have another hitch in our idea of being able to classify and organize everything on Earth, and that's analogous structures. Analogous structures make things look similar or act similar, but they're not related. For example, we have 4 different types of wings here. The wings all have the same function. The function is to allow your critter to fly, but the wings are not related. They're not made the same. They didn't evolve at the same time. They don't have the same components. A feather is not the same as skin, is not the same as a butterfly wing or a moth wing. So how these things came into existence are unrelated to each other, even though their form is similar. And so that makes morphological species concepts a little bit harder. Here's another example of an analogous structure. I have a dolphin. It's got a streamlined body with a dorsal fin, a tail, and two side flippers. Here I have a shark. It's got a streamlined body with a dorsal fin, a tail, and two side flippers. These are not closely related. A dolphin is a mammal, and a shark is so ancient that it doesn't even have bones. It's got a cartilaginous skeleton. And so they are very far apart from each other in the history of organisms existing on Earth, but they look really similar. And they look really similar because they live in the same environment. And if you're aquatic, you need to be able to control where you're going, and you need a powerful tail to push you forward. And so their body form is the same, even though it's unrelated. So those are analogous structures. Another example is the eyeball. So lots of organisms have eyes. Insects have compound eyes, which are individual little lenses that they use to see different things. Spiders have really cool giant eyes, but they don't have a lens. And then other organisms like vertebrates, this is a hawk and this is an octopus, they have lenses in their eyes. Each of these eyes develop separately. They're different materials. They're different in their function, but why they exist, to see light and to use that visual stimulus to respond to your environment, is the same. So those are unrelated, but same function. The opposite of analogous structures are homologous structures, homo being same, so homologous. In homologous structures, these structures are related, but they have different functions. For example, I have 4 different mammals here, a human, a bat, a whale, and a cat, and we're looking at their upper limb. So my arm has 1 bone, 2 bones, many bones, and then 5 fingers. That's true for everyone. So here's my humerus, my radius and my ulna, my carpals, and then my phalanges. Now my hand is used for grasping, for writing, for manipulating. Bats doesn't do that. A bat uses their front limbs to fly, just like a bird would, but birds don't have the same bones. Bats, since they're mammals, they have the same bones. If I look into a bat wing, I have a humerus, I have a radius and an ulna, and I have 5 phalanges. So the structure is the same, but the function is different. And that's true for a whale too. So a whale flipper, they have finger bones inside of their finger, or inside of their flippers, even though they don't have fingers. And so here I have the humerus, the radius and the ulna, the carpals, and the phalanges. So there's fingers in there. It's really amazing. And then a cat, they have a similar structure. Even though a cat has little toe beans and they're super cute, a cat can't grasp and manipulate things with its fingers like I can, but the structure is really similar. It has a humerus, it has a radius and ulna, it has carpals, and then cats have 5 on the front and 4 in the back. So they have a different number of toes, but the structures are the same. So each of these we say is conserved. The format for the limb is the same, but the function of the limb, whether it's flying or swimming or standing, is different. Here we have a view of a cat paw and a human paw together, and you can see how very similar the bone structure is. So I find that lovely, especially in the wrist. You can see the carpals look really similar. Here's the attachment of the radius and the ulna. And then our phalanges are different based on what they're used for. Our phalanges are used for tactile manipulation, and a cat's phalanges are used for walking. And so they are differently shaped, but the bones are really similar. Thus, these are homologous structures. Now that we have classifications based on our naming system, domain through species, and we know that we can base our identifying of species on morphological, biological, or genetic species concepts, how do we show organisms being related to each other? And the answer to that is phylogenetic trees. In phylogenetic trees, we're indicating relationships based on how long ago there was a common ancestor. Here I have a phylogenetic tree. The word taxa refers to the type of species. So this could be a cat, right? And this other here is a different species. It's another taxa. That could be something like a rabbit. So I'm using my mouse to write, so forgive my handwriting. Taxa are the groups or the species that you're looking at. I used cat and rabbit, but I could have easily have said that these are mammals and aves, which is birds, or these are amphibians and reptiles. So those are the groups or the species that you're looking at. So species. They're called terminal taxa when they're up at the top like this. And what's cool about our phylogenetics trees is we are representing time. So down here, this is newer, this is now, and at the bottom is in the past. So this is the past, this is older. This could be 100 years ago, or it could be several million years ago. The base of your tree is called a root if there's a little projection on the bottom. So this little projection here is the root. And we're using the word root to use vocab from a tree. Then you have a branching event. So each of these is a branch. Here's a branch. And then there's a secondary branch. Here's a branch. When these two things branch, the point where they were once connected is called a node. So where they were connected is your node, and the branches are connecting your nodes. So this is a branch going to C, and then here's the node where it connects. This is a branch leading to D, and here's the node where E and D connect. At each of these branching events, what we're saying is there was one organism, and it has changed, and it has turned into a different organism. And that's over time, like huge amounts of time, usually, sometimes really quickly, like viruses change quickly. And we've been able to track birds changing species pretty quickly. But what we're saying is taxa A and taxa B, these two groups have a common ancestor, and this is the ancestor between them. And at this point, at this node, they split. Maybe this is humans and chimpanzees, but this here, this node, your nodes indicate a recent common ancestor. The M is most. So your most recent common ancestor. So if I wanted to see where the more common recent ancestor was for these three groups, I would follow the branches back until I get to the connector for all three. So at this point here, this node, this is the connector for taxa C and D and E. So you follow the branches down. This would be the most common recent ancestor for all three taxa here. This branching point, from there on, I have those three taxa. So trees can be a little bit wonky. We're going to practice how to use them. The other thing I want to make sure that we mention are traits. So we can add traits to trees. This tree isn't showing any traits yet, but let's say that C, D, and E are all mammals. If we wanted to add being a mammal to this tree, we put a little line on it, and then we say, this is where mammals start. Now, this is a trait. Being a mammal is a trait, and I've added it right here on my tree. And what that indicates is from this point forward, from this point on in time, because back here is older than up here at the end, mammals evolved. And these three things from this point forward are all going to be mammals. Now, there's a branching here. There was some ancestor that was common to C, D, and E, And then later in time, because as you go up your tree, time increases, there is another branching event. And that indicates that D and E, they are more closely related to each other. And they're more closely related to each other because as I go down the branches, the first node that I hit, that is the common ancestor between D and E. So D and E are more closely related to each other because they had an ancestor that is newer than the ancestor between C, D, and E. Erase all the pink. I also want to talk about some vocab here. We have in-groups and out-groups. If I was talking about mammals, my in-group is going to be all the mammals together, and my out-group will be everything else. If we have an out-group or an in-group that's just two taxa like this, we call them sister taxa. So we'll ask about sister taxa periodically on phylogenetic trees, and that's two organisms that are more closely related to each other than they are to other groups. I can tell that A and B are more closely related to each other than they are to C, D, and E, because here they have a common ancestor. C, D, and E have a common ancestor down here, and all five of them have a common ancestor right down at the root. So whatever this organism was here, it branched into the two groups, including all five. So this was the common ancestor of everybody on the tree. All right. If your group goes all the way to the tips of the branches, like A, B, C, and D do, those are all in existence. If they're in existence, that means that they are extinct. The opposite of extant is extinct. Imagine that I had another group, we'll call it F, and F comes off right here, but F does not go all the way to the terminal branches. F is extinct. I know F is extinct because remember, time is going from the past to now, and F did not make it to now. So F here is not existing in current time. And so F must be an extinct taxa because it did not extend to our current time period. So you can tell who's extinct, you can tell who's extant, which means alive, you can tell who's more related to who and where the common ancestors are. Okay, let's do a little practice. Here I have a phylogenetic tree. It shows lamprey, which are a type of aquatic, not a fish, but like almost a fish. Think of like more of an eel, but with a skeleton. Beautiful, wonderful creatures you're going to learn about, but don't visualize a fish. Visualize an eel more, but it has a bony skeleton. Then we have fish, which have an actual like fins and gills and flippers. Eels and lampreys do not have fins and gills and flippers. We have lizards, which are reptiles, and then we have rabbits and humans. Both of those are mammals. So in our phylogenetic tree, we have a couple things to know. First, it's not rooted. There is no root. If I wanted it to be rooted, I would add a little projection down to the bottom. That's a personal preference thing. You can root or not root your tree, up to you. There are conventions about it, but it's not a huge idea. So here is an unrooted tree. It is showing you that everything from here to here is vertebrata, which means that they have a vertebrae. Lamprey, fish, lizards, and rabbits and humans all have a vertebrae. The outgroup, who is least related to everyone else, is going to be lamprey. Lamprey, their most common recent ancestor with everyone else is all the way at the bottom. So that is a more ancient common ancestor. Then you go up here and we have a branch. So this branch divides fish from everyone else. So fish are least related to everyone else than they are to your lamprey here. Then you have lizard. Lizards, rabbits, and humans are all in the group Amniota. That means that they have some form of liquid surrounding their developing babies. In lizards, it's in an egg, so it's enclosed in an egg. In rabbits and humans, it's the placenta. And so all of these together are amniotes. So here we can tell that lizards, rabbits, and humans are more closely related to each other than they are to fish. Whereas fish, lizards, rabbits, and humans are more closely related to each other than anyone is to lamprey. So lamprey is our out group. Everyone else is the in group. And then we do have a sister taxa. Rabbits and humans are more closely related to each other than they are to anyone else on the tree. And so they are sister taxa to each other. I want you to practice this. And the question to practice is a domestic dog, here is Roro, my colleague's dog, more closely related to a domestic cat, here's Max and Parker, or to a skunk? So I'm asking you about dog, more related to cats or more related to skunks? Take a moment, pause the video, and draw a tree for your answer. I'm going to draw a couple answers here because I assume that you paused the video already and did it. So if I thought that a dog was more closely related to a cat, I would have put dog and cat together as sister taxa, and I would have put the skunk out here. If I thought that the dog was more closely related to the skunk, I would put the dog and the skunk and then the cat out here. So now the dog and the skunk are more closely related to each other than either is to the cat. Here, the dog and the cat are more closely related to each other than either is to the skunk. And the question was about the dog, so that's why the dog is the one that's changing. So each of these says something different, even though the structure of the tree is similar. Are you ready to hear the answer? Who is a dog more closely related to? And I have our tree of carnivora, of which all of those organisms are on. In carnivora, here's the roots. We have this branching event. The out group, which is less related to anyone else, is the Phylogeny. The example that they're showing is a panther, but we know that cats are in Phylogeny. The other side of the tree, we have a branching event right here. So in these two groups, they're more closely related to each other than either is to the cat. In that branching event, we have dogs. So we have our two dogs that we know, Canis lupus. We have the wolf and we have Canis lupus familiaris, the domestic dog. Those two are sister taxa. They are more closely related to each other than anyone else. But then down here, this node where the branching occurs happens with the mustidae, and that includes skunks and otters. So skunks and otters are more closely related to each other than they are to canines. But if we look at these two groups, the Canidae and the Mustelidae, these two groups are more closely related to each other than either is to the Felidae. So that means that skunks and dogs are more closely related to each other than dogs and cats are related to each other. And I can tell because the branch that includes skunks and the branch that includes dogs, they have a more recent common ancestor. It is further up in the tree, which means it's more recent in time than either of them have a branch with Felidae. So they are least related to cats. Let's keep practicing. You're going to make a cladogram, which is the same thing as a phylogenetic tree. It's just a synonym. So you're going to make a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree of fruit. You have 4 fruit. You have a banana, an orange, a red apple, and a green apple. On appearance alone, so I'm telling you to use the morphological species concept, which of these is an outgroup and which two belong on the furthest node from the start of the diagram, which is asking you which two are sister taxa. Go ahead and pause it, draw your tree. I'm going to start drawing it now because you've already paused the video. In this, I think that bananas are least like everything else. So I'm going to put bananas as the outgroup. Bananas are going to have the furthest common ancestor, so the furthest node from the other groups. I'm going to branch off one more, and then I'm going to have my sister taxa. So in this, I think that oranges should be the next one because I have two types of apples. So the two types of apples have to be more related to each other. I have green apple and I have red apple. And I know they're more related to each other because they're apple, but I did say based on the morphological species concept. So when I look at apples, they have a thin skin, they have a stem on top, and then they have a little like bump on the bottom where the base of the flower was. If I cut them open, they have a core with seeds. I don't see that inside of an orange. An orange has a thick rind, it has a pith, and then the inside of it is segmented into juicy pieces. So this seems least similar to the apples. And the banana is weirder than all of them. Bananas are technically a berry, and a banana has a peel on the outside and then a mushy center with itty bitty little fruits. So this is how I've organized it. My sister taxa are the green and the red apple because morphologically they're more similar. I put orange as the next because at least it's round. So morphologically, the orange would be the third in my group. And then the last that I put alone is the banana, because the banana is the most dissimilar to the other, in my opinion, based on morphology. All right, here's the practice question. I have this tree. Based on this tree, which species is sister group to the birds? Which species is least related to the other? And which species have mammary glands? Pause the video and answer it yourself. Let's find birds. To figure out the sister group of birds, I'm going to go down and I'm going to find out who is related based on the closest node. This closest node connects to crocodiles. Birds and crocodiles are sister taxa. They might not look anything alike, but they are more related to each other than they are to the other organisms on this tree. Which species is least like the others? I can go from the base up and I find the first branch. This branch indicates the oldest common ancestor. So here's the branch that's oldest, and it connects to sharks. Sharks are least related to anything else on the tree. That makes sense to me because sharks are in a group called chondroichthyes. They don't even have bones. They have a cartilaginous skeleton. Everyone else here has actual bones. And so that helps me identify that sharks are the least related. And I can verify that by seeing that they have the lowest node, the most ancient node. So that indicates that whatever existed in this time period, it's split, it's speciated. And whatever it's split into, one of those organisms became what we call sharks now. And one of those organisms gave rise to everything else on this tree. Which species have mammary glands? Here I have my list of traits. I have vertebral column, and then if it goes across it, those organisms have it. So everyone on this tree has a vertebral column. Everyone has a bony skeleton except sharks. Everyone has 4 limbs except whales, but it's a question mark. It's a question mark because if you look at a whale skeleton, they actually have hip bones and they have a little tiny back leg bone, even though they don't have back legs. And so that indicates to us that they evolved from something that used to have back legs, and there's still a vestigial structure from when they used to have legs, even though they don't anymore. Then a fenestra is a type of hole in the bone. So here we have a lower temporal fenestra. Temporal is this part of your head. So this is my temporal bone, and an upper temporal fenestra. So those are holes in these bones. We have an amniotic egg. We have mammary glands, and we have endothermy, which means they're warm-blooded. Our question was, which species have mammary glands? And it's just these two. If I look at the connector between them, it's whales and humans. So who has mammary glands? It's mammals. Those are the two that are included in that group. Let's try it again. Which species is the sister group to rodents? Which is the out group? And which have vertebrae? Go ahead and pause it and answer it yourself. Let's find rodents. Here's rodents. To figure out the sister group, we go back to the most recent common ancestor, that's right here. Who's connected? Primates. Rodents and primates are sister taxa. They are more closely related to each other than they are to anyone else on the tree. Who is the outgroup? Go to the bottom, find the first branching event, so the first node, and who is alone on that branch? Sharks. Sharks are still the outgroup. This is a very similar tree to what we were just looking at. And which species have vertebrae? Now, instead of the trait being shown as a line across the tree, your trait is shown as a little hash bar. And then from this point on, if I were to like take scissors and clip that tree at that point and pick up the rest of the branches, everything that I picked up would have that trait. So think of it as like a radiating point from here. So vertebrae includes everything from this point on, which is everyone. Everyone in this tree has vertebrae. Let's do the same thing, but for a different trait. Who has 4 limbs? Here's my 4-limb. It would include everything from this point on, which is amphibians through birds and dinosaurs. It does not include anything that connected below it. So ray-finned fish do not have 4 limbs. Sharks do not have 4 limbs. Here we have hair. Hair is only found in this chunk of the tree. So it's primates and rodents. And 2 post-orbital fenestra, those are the holes in the skull, only found in this piece of the tree. But the amniotic egg, that's all of these 4 organisms. So from this point on, so this point upward, everyone has an amniotic egg. So we have groups nestled within groups on our tree, and we get a whole lot of information from these cladograms, from these phylogenetic trees. Remember, those 2 things mean the same thing. They don't technically, but they do for us. If we talk about the nesting of traits in a tree, we can call them clades. So a clade is also called a monophyletic group. And what that means is you are taking a point on a tree and you're talking about everything that's included from that branching point on. So this is a mono being 1, phylo referring to the tree, and then group, monophyletic group. So here, if I were to cut that tree, I've included this branch and everybody that's related to it. So that would be a clade. If I want to talk about this point on, I would take everyone from this point, including the yellow. So I have a clade within a clade. They can nest. I actually have a second clade here. If I took this chunk, I'm including that branch and all of its descendants. That is also a clade. So here I have many different clades inside of a clade. The point of a clade is that you are taking one piece of a phylogenetic tree and you are including all of the descendants, not some, all. Here are a couple examples of what are clades and what are not clades. So if I were to clip this tree at this point, all of the relatives from this are included. That is a clade. It is monophyletic. Everyone is included. Here, I could take just a branch. That's still a clade because from this point on, I've included everyone that is related on that branch, even if it's just one group. Now, what is not a clade? If I wanted to talk about flagellates and ciliates, but I didn't want to talk about everyone else, that is not a clade because I would have to make it monophyletic, I would have to include everyone from here on. So I would have to include this entire group for it to be a clade. But if I'm talking about just 2 of the descendants from this point on, it is not a clade. Same here, if I want to talk about plants and animals, so here's my cutoff point. It is not a clade unless I include fungi. So you have to include all of the descendants for a clade to be monophyletic. Now, we do have words for when we talk about some of the descendants, but not all. In a paraphyletic group, para means like almost, like paranormal, almost normal. In a paraphyletic group, you include some of the ancestors but not all the descendants. For example, if I wanted to talk about lemurs and lorises and tarsiers, all of which are really cool mammals that live in the trees, I would talk about this group here. It is not monophyletic because to be monophyletic, I would have to talk about all the primates. So I'm not including all of the descendants from this point on. So it's paraphyletic. I'm talking about just some, but not all. Then if it's polyphyletic, poly means many. Polyphyletic groups are like various. So in paraphyletic, I'm talking about some of the descendants, but not all. In polyphyletic, it's kind of like a grab bag. Like I want to talk about lorises and tarsiers, but lorises are a sister group to lemurs, and those are least related to everyone else on the tree. And so talking about tarsiers is like pulling someone from a different organization. It's just, they're far related from each other. Same thing if I want to talk about lemurs and humans, that would be a polyphyletic group because those are not closely related to each other. So it's not some of the descendants, they're really quite far related from each other. Now, phylogenetic trees get updated all the time because they're what we think their relationships are, but we don't really know, especially for things that happened in the past. Like we can see morphologically how organisms change over time. We can check their genetics. We can see whether or not they can interbreed, but we don't ever get to know what happened a million years ago because we can't go back and watch. And so these are hypotheses, and we can verify their likelihoods based on statistics and these giant computer programs that will take all of your genetic changes and run them through programs and see what's most likely, but we don't know for sure. And so phylogenetic trees are hypotheses. And I think that's really fun because in biology, we never know like capital T true, what's true, because we don't know much. Like we're new as a species. The study of life is new. We're still learning. We estimate that we only know 5% of fungus on Earth. So how can we pretend that we understand that fungi is related to each other when we only have a small sample of what exists? And so that's why phylogenetics trees change all the time. Here's an example. We have a tree before where we put whales over here, and this is an ancestral group. Then we had camels and ruminants. Ruminants are going to be things like goats and cows. Then we had pigs and hippos and horses. And over time, we changed our mind and we learned that hippos and whales are actually more closely related to each other. And so this tree where whale and hippos were not sister taxa changed. Now we think that they're sister taxa, and we'll talk about that as well later in the term. And so trees adjust, trees change as we learn. So trees are our best hypotheses at the moment, but they're totally open to interpretation. And you can also change a tree based on whether or not you're talking about the biological or the morphological species concept. Sometimes trees that look different are representing the same thing. So here I have two different trees. In these trees, I've included different types of plants. Malus here is apples. So this looks like there's just one group of apples. But if I took all the different species of apples that I want to discuss and how those species of apples are related to each other, and I showed that on the tree, it would look way different because now I have lots of the genus Malus and I have many different species of the genus, but the tree's the same. In each of these, you have a sister taxa of apples to Eriolobus, and that's true in this as well. The sister taxa have not changed. The outgroup has not changed, but the tree looks different because it's showing more or less detail. We can also rotate around the arms. So which statement about this phylogeny is accurate? Go ahead and read them and answer it to yourself. So option A, B, and C are extinct. That's not true because they're terminal taxa, so it's not A. Option B, C and D share a common ancestor more recently than B and D. So C and D, they share a common recent ancestor more recently than B and D. That is true. Let's check the rest. Species D will display the most advanced morphological characteristics. So this is a misconception because our trees tend to skew right because we write right to left in English. There tends to be a habit of putting the outgroup on the left and the sister taxa on the right, but that doesn't mean that they're more or less advanced. So this is not an indicator that it's more advanced. So C is not correct. Species D is more closely related to species A. That is not true. Species D, if I look at the nodes, is more closely related to C, and then it's more closely related to B, and then the least related it's to is A, because A is the outgroup. And then option E, species D evolved from species C, that is not true. So these are not indicating that they evolved from each other. It's just showing that in the past, there was an organism that gave rise to both of them. They could be distinct, but they're not turning into each other. So that's a misconception of human evolution, is if this was humans and this was chimpanzees, we're not saying that we evolved from chimpanzees. That's not true. What is true is that there is a common ancestor that both chimpanzees and humans share. So there was something in the past that gave rise to both of us, but we didn't turn from monkeys into humans. That's just not an accurate statement. There's lots of misconceptions about human evolution that we'll talk about in detail when we talk about human evolution. And I know that there's a lot of feelings about human evolution. So if you ever want to talk about it, please email me. I'm super interested in hearing your perspective. True or false? Outgroups are always extinct. False. And that's false because here I have my outgroup, but it's at the same line as the rest of my taxa. Note that I've rotated my tree. It's still representing time. So from the roots, this is older, to the taxa, this is current. Each of these are lined up at the same. All of them are extant. So none of these organisms are extinct, even if my tree is rotated on its side. Here I have my 3 domains of life. And I like to show this to you because now we're adding a different type of tree. So we have our traditional rooted phylogenetic tree that we've been working with. Here are my branching events. Here are my nodes. This is the root. And then I have an unrooted circular tree. So these unrooted circular tree are saying the same thing. I still have a branching event that led to my 3 different domains. My domain for bacteria, which is huge. My domain for archaea, which is green. Remember, archaea are like bacteria, but they live in extreme environments. And then my branching event for eukarya. So eukarya are all more closely related to each other than either is to bacteria, and eukarya and archaea are more closely related to each other than they are to bacteria. And that's what we see on this too. Bacteria is the outgroup. Archaea and eukarya are more closely related to each other than either is to bacteria. So 2 different ways to represent it. Depending on what you like, that's how you choose to do your tree. This is our real tree of life. This is the most accepted. It's from 2016. Here's our citing of our author. And in this, they use DNA from 3,083 different species. And then they put all the DNA changes, all the likelihoods of when that DNA would change, whether or not there's recombinant information on the chromosomes used, and they put all that into a supercomputer. And the supercomputer created hundreds of thousands of different options and then rated the likelihood that those options would exist. And the most likely tree is this one. We say that something that is most likely is the most parsimonious. Parsimonious is our vocab word for more likely. Now, parsimony is based on the idea that the simplest answer is probably accurate. There's another term for that. You might have heard Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually the correct one. That's true in biology as well. It's more likely that this tree exists than other trees because it's the most common that was produced by the supercomputer. So it's the highest likelihood that this is our best tree of life. So let's look at this tree of life. It's unrooted. Here is the branching event. So all of this, everything up here is bacteria. Majority of life on Earth is bacteria. Bacteria are way more numerous and diverse than everything else. And then we come down here, we have a branching event. This is all eukarya. So here's eukarya here. And then, I'm sorry, archaea here. And then in green, this is the eukarya. So we are this one little fin on this entire tree of life. And in this group eukarya, Opisthocompa, that's the group that we exist in. So we're right down here in this little fin of all of the life on Earth. Darwin was one of the first people to write this idea. So here's his quote. It's from 1837. It's from his journal. His handwriting is kind of hard to read. It starts up here. So I think case must be, and then you can read the rest of the quote, and it ends on the next page. And then here is his first drawing of a phylogenetic tree. He's got species A, B, C, D. He's got branching points. He doesn't have a timeline established, like going from older to newer. But this was a super controversial idea back in the day, because the idea in Darwin's time was that things were existed perfectly and were placed there, and they didn't change over time. And so this was kind of drastic. In fact, he was hesitant to share this idea, and he waited years and years and years to publish it. But this beautiful, I think, and first tree is a really famous image. And so I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to see it and to see the quote about it. Now, we've been showing trees as linear with one path up the branches and one branching event called nodes. We don't really think that's real because life is kind of messy. And so now maybe we want to be changing from a tree to a web. And in this web, instead of having one ancestor that we all descended from, we have like a pot of ancestors. And this makes sense because we know that endosymbiotic events occurred. So the original prokaryotes engulfed mitochondria and chloroplasts, and they became eukaryotes because they engulf those other critters. And we know that there is swapping of DNA, and there's recombination of DNA, and there's hybridization. And so there's lots of different ways that organisms could have become related from different other organisms. And so they like to show a ficus tree now, where it has these giant connector roots. And so our tree may not have one sole trunk. It might have many different trunks. And there could be lots of other paths to get to wherever you're getting to. So it's probably the reality, but we can't use this to do actual discussions of relationships of organisms because it's too messy. And so we do use the phylogenetic trees, even though we're aware that it's not the full story. There's definitely more going on. So email me anytime. I hope you have a lovely day, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.